This morning, frightening new video of deadly floodwaters in Tennessee. In Nashville, more than 7 inches of rain in 48 hours sent rivers raging, swallowing streets, school buses, and catching many off guard. Among them, a police officer, water sweeping his cruiser right off the road.
He was able to get out of his car. He was clinging to a tree for safety till he was rescued.
Fire crews making at least 130 high water rescues, saving people trapped in cars, homes, and apartments. Those first responders also pulling 40 pets to safety. The intense rain, one of the wettest 24-hour periods in Nashville's history, marking the city's worst flooding since 2010, when 21 people died. The view from above, even more stark. Parking lots turned ponds near evacuated neighborhoods.
The water got up into all the structures, the homes. We have about 50 houses that were affected.
Hundreds trying to salvage whatever they can. Andy Benedict helping every neighbor he could find.
You know, we're just cleaning up things that were carried away by the water. It's just an all hands on deck, massive cleanup effort.
In Arkansas, the same storm system spawned not one, but 2 tornadoes. The National Weather Service saying damage indicates winds topped 120 miles an hour. And in Georgia, the added rain only dampened recovery efforts from the massive EF4 twister that tore through the town of Noonan. Back here in Tennessee, the big question, when will Mother Nature finally let up?
You know, it's mostly things that are damaged and ruined, and as long as it's just things, then the community will rally around those people in need, and we'll make it right through.
And lots of help headed this way. We do know officials are expected to tour damaged areas today to get a better idea of just how much damage this flooding leaves behind. In the meantime, there is some good news in that the major creeks and rivers have already crested, but it could be days before these waters finally recede.
Easter holidaymakers are being warned to stay off the Hawkesbury River, now a major navigation and possibly health hazard. 7 News joined a tour with senior government figures who say devastated locals also need a little respect.
The banks of the Hawkesbury, unstable, dangerous, once a safe haven for so many. Before today, we'd only seen this carnage from the air.
Sitting on the river looking at it from here, like, it gives it a different perspective. It's people's homes, it's their memories.
The minister in disbelief and pleading for everyone else to stay away.
You know, we've got Easter this weekend. Don't use the Hawkesbury. Like, you can't be out on the river and, you know, be here for recreational purposes.
Tons of sand has shifted. The water's septic. Not all debris is floating.
Things in that water which will kill you if you hit them.
The only vessels welcome here are ferries. A few are back online, a small start in reconnecting communities. Those reliant on roads now shredded, no guarantees, but a long wait to be rebuilt. As far as repairs go, all they have are estimates. How much will all this cost to fix? At least $80 million, but probably more. How long will it take to fix all these roads? That's anybody's guess. Some surety, at least in Wiseman's Ferry, a community that feared being forgotten.
Oh, well, that's good, yeah.
A promise they won't be.
I tell you what, I was very surprised. Yeah, it was very good.
In a town where hope is needed as much as help.
Eufrasia Hurtado is worried about getting this oxygen tank filled for her mother and sister, who are ill at home with COVID-19. Days before polls open, Eufrasia says her family is facing the raging pandemic alone, and the elections are not all that important.
Nada no están haciendo.
The candidates aren't doing anything for us. They don't stick to their promises. It's only words. Unfortunately, it's a great disappointment. I'll vote blank because they are all the same.
Recent opinion polls say nearly 30% of Peruvians may vote blank or null because they can't find anyone who represents them. Many Peruvians are worried about some candidates on the ballot. Of the 18 presidential candidates, the front runner is a former congressman who was once suspended for sexual harassment. Another, a respected economist, relies on advice from a comedian. And there's a religious, ultra-conservative businessman who owes the Treasury millions and openly insults anyone he dislikes on the campaign trail. None of the presidential candidates have more than a 13% approval rating. Analysts say the elections couldn't be held at a worse time.
It's as if the Titanic was going down and someone said, let's choose a new captain. But everyone's looking for a lifeboat. The political scene is so weak and limited that there's no large group of voters who perceives any of the candidates as a good option.
The last presidential term was rocked by political instability, with 3 presidents unseated during that period, a Congress dissolved, a congressional coup, and violent protests. An interim leader was finally sworn in last November. After 5 years of political upheaval, the impact of the pandemic has pushed Peru deeper into political and economic chaos, and many believe the elections will not guarantee political stability. With 18 candidates and 20 political parties competing, the next Congress will likely be fragmented. For Jocelyn Palomino, the elections will be useless.
Nothing is solved. There are no vaccines. I'm frustrated not knowing when this crisis will stop. There are no jobs. It's sad. So many people we love are dying, and we have no support. It's very sad.
With a vote so divided, there will be a ballotage. And that could mean that the next president could be a lame duck.
The lines are growing in the center of Rio de Janeiro, and not just in front of the soup kitchens. Many come here for a bath and a haircut.
The number of people living in the streets has doubled since the beginning of the pandemic. Many here have lost their jobs and homes.
10 million Brazilians were already going hungry when the pandemic began. Now the situation is much worse. In January, the government suspended the emergency aid benefiting half of Brazil's population, just as infections began to spiral out of control, forcing new lockdowns.
The crisis affected private businesses, which were contributing to charity last year and can no longer afford to do so. With no help from the public sector and no jobs, people in the slums and poor neighborhoods are literally starving to death.
Reginaldo Lima is part of the G10, a group of Brazil's 10 biggest slums. They have started the campaign Empty Pots in Brazil. Together, they were able to obtain the first donation this year. 1,000 basic food baskets to share among way too many. 180,000 people live in the Rocinha slum alone.
Last year we received 10,000 basic food baskets to distribute, but this year it was only 100. Donations dropped by 95%, and the number of people dying from COVID-19 is growing. I just lost 10 friends in 1 week.
William has been walking the streets of Rocinha to pick those who have nothing in their pots. Like Marli, who lives with her 86-year-old mother and stopped working after she got sick.
7 out of 10 people living in Brazilian slums have no money to buy food. They're receiving donations, but much less than last year. A bag like this one, for example, has rice and beans and oil. It costs the equivalent of $10. But it only lasts 1 week in a family of 4.
COVID-19 has affected donations in another way. Duane Vasconcelos tells us the number of people working in soup kitchens has decreased. Some volunteers were infected with the coronavirus, while others are too afraid to go out on the streets.
After months of delay and contradictory messages from the Ministry of Health, Iraq's COVID-19 vaccination campaign has begun.
We've now received 336,000 vaccines and they've been distributed according to plan to health clinics across Iraq. The priority are health workers, security forces, the elderly and people with immunity disorders.
That prioritization plan has yet to be implemented. The government first asked people to register online, but because of limited uptake, it then opened the doors to everyone, including young people like Faisal.
There isn't enough encouragement from the government to take the vaccine. So I don't have the priority to take the vaccine, but I know if I don't come and take it, maybe it would get expired and nobody's going to take it.
Indeed, this batch of vaccines expires at the end of May. Authorities race against time to mobilize a reluctant public that distrusts both the government and science.
65-year-old Abderrahman should be a priority candidate. He suffers from hypertension, diabetes, and had one of his kidneys removed. But he has no intention of getting the vaccine.
People are scared, especially the elderly. Vaccines contain cortisol, which can stop the lungs. So if you ask the elderly about taking the vaccine, their answer will be no.
Iraq's government is facing a dual challenge when it comes to inoculating the population. On the one hand, it must convince people to get the vaccine, and at the same time, it's struggling to secure doses from global suppliers. The AstraZeneca inoculations Iraq has received are part of 16 million doses it has been allocated under COVAX.
Several 100,000 people come through the center every day. Nurses are first vaccinating police, doctors, teachers, and those over 58 years old.
People are willing to get vaccinated. You know, it was open for public today. We've done a lot of work so far since morning, and we are still expecting to do more.
195,000 people have already received the AstraZeneca vaccine. The detection of blood clots in a handful of inoculated people held up the rollout of the doses in Europe. There is still uncertainty among the population.
There's a bit of fear in some people. We are educating them on the contraindications and what to expect. And they are okay with it.
There aren't enough doses to stop the third wave, so the government has sealed off 5 of the worst affected counties. Schools, sports grounds and restaurants have been closed.
He announced it when we least expected, and it was the time that the business had started growing and started picking up from the previous damage that we had. We had to close down for the lockdown. It really affected us because for the Easter we really had our plans.
The doctors' union says these measures are difficult but necessary as intensive care units remain full and oxygen cylinders empty.
It's a step in the right direction, which I'm happy about, and I think we could do more. Part of it is teaching ourselves the culture of always having a mask on, washing our hands. If we inculcate that habit in ourselves, we might not need those strict measures that have been put in place.
The third wave is expected to peak in May.
A weekend in Rome and people out and about enjoying the Easter break. But reminders of the COVID-19 restrictions are never far away.
It's been more than a year now since the first restrictive measures were imposed in Italy. We were probably among the first countries to confront this emergency, and people are tired, but they're aware that protecting health is essential in these times.
All regions are now classified as red zones. People can leave home to exercise or to visit relatives once a day. But police are checking nobody's travelling between regions.
I'm glad they are doing checks. It means something is working in this whole mess.
Over in Lyon, in southeastern France, this man was one of thousands getting a coronavirus jab inside the city football stadium on Saturday. With intensive care units as full as they were last April, the country's speeding up its vaccination programme over Easter.
For us volunteers and for the people who come here, these are quite stressful times. So by doing this, hopefully we can get through it more quickly.
From Saturday, there's a nationwide curfew between 7 p.m. and 6 a.m. President Emmanuel Macron says authorities will take a relaxed view this weekend if people travel beyond the permitted 10 kilometres. But from Monday night, they'll be checking such journeys are essential. In Spain, traditional Easter processions are cancelled, but in Barcelona, some have been making the most of the weather. Spain's still in a state of emergency and new cases have been rising. A new national law says people have to wear a mask outdoors, and gatherings of more than 6 people are banned in this region, but here at least they're taking a measured approach. In Britain, police forces have asked people not to travel long distances over the holiday, while the Prime Minister's issued his own reminder.
You can meet up as 2 households or 6 people outside. Always remember, outside is much safer than indoors as far as spreading the virus.
The speed of the UK's vaccination programme means the government's on track with what it calls its cautious, irreversible roadmap to freedom.
It was a very different address, again, for a second year in the row. What we're used to in the past is St. Peter's Square packed with pilgrims, tourists, but of course it was completely empty, and the Pope delivered his message inside the Vatican. It was broadcast, of course, on TV, radio, and online, so people followed it that way. Now, this is his Urbi et Orbi, the traditional Easter message that he gives every year, and he touched on particular hotspots around the world in terms of strife, such as in Myanmar, but also in Syria. But really, it was interesting, his talk about the pandemic, talking about the fact that he called basically for more government support to help those that have been economically suffering as a result of the pandemic, and also for government support in the better distribution of vaccines, dealing with those delays that we've seen and read about here in Europe, for instance, but also in the better distribution of vaccines to the poorest countries, because it's not enough that these vaccines are being produced pretty much in well-off countries, but they need to make sure, in his opinion, that those vaccines get out to those who need it the most in the poorest countries, something that he said so in the past and continues to reiterate as he did today in that Easter message, a very different Easter, of course.
China is looking to lead a new world order that better aligns with its political views and interests. The nation's foreign minister recently took several trips to countries that identify as American allies, a move many saw as China trying to challenge the traditional international order. Tensions also came to a head between the U.S. and China earlier this month during the first face-to-face meeting under the Biden administration. For more on this, I'm joined now by Isaac Stonefish. He's a CBSN contributor and founder of Strategy Risks. Hi there, Isaac. Nice to see you. So what is China's argument for why it would serve as a better global leader than the U.S.? And what does a new world order look like under China?
We're certainly going in that direction. Beijing is positioning itself as an alternative to the U.S.-led world order, which both contains strong elements of democracy and liberalism and an emphasis on human rights, but also what Beijing likes to see as increased meddling in other countries' internal affairs. And what Beijing is trying to communicate to countries around the world is that you can have both economic growth and political stability, not seeing the kind of things like we saw in the United States on January 6th. Of course, there's a lot that I would say is problematic with Beijing's telling about how the world can be and how its own world is, but that's the message that the party that rules China is trying to communicate.
Well, what exactly does China need to do if it actually wants to achieve this? How does it garner support among other nations?
A big part of Beijing's push is trying to increase influence in the United Nations, especially among African nations. There's a lot of soft power that Beijing is exerting across countries in that region, across countries in Asia as well. Some of it involves sweetheart deals. Some of it involves corruption and bribery with local leaders. Some of it involves a heavier emphasis on Beijing's view of things, often told through Chinese media outlets like the People's Daily or Xinhua or the nationalistic tabloid Global Times. And then part of it involves trying to counter the U.S. position and trying to counter what the U.S. is saying about its own country and its own struggles.
Well, meantime, China and Russia have grown closer in recent years and share similar sentiments that the U.S. is in no position to criticize other nations. Last week, the Chinese and Russian foreign ministers called on the U.S. to think about the damage they say that the U.S. has caused to international peace. How could we see some sort of alliance form between these nations as China looks to become the new leader on the international stage?
I think the issue is that America certainly has caused a lot of damage on the international stage, but America allows for free criticism of its people of that damage. And the damage that Russia and especially China has caused doesn't get a fair airing inside those countries because of the controls that they have. I think in terms of the relationship between China and Russia, while they are close right now and certainly could grow a lot closer, we do have to remember that there's a lot of people in the Russian security establishment who are very fearful about what Beijing is doing and are worried that they're going to be very much the junior partner in this relationship, and that might be harmful for them and their interests. So it'll be really interesting to see if those two countries do work together to counter the U.S. or if their relationship splits up in the near future too.
Now to Mozambique, where insurgents affiliated with ISIS are laying siege to the northern city of Palma. As the country's armed forces struggle to defend the area, civilians were killed and thousands are displaced. The violence is deepening a humanitarian crisis already affecting the African nation. Deborah Pata reports.
As ISIS fighters laid siege to Palma, the country's armed forces proved to be no match for them. Instead, it was left to a group of South African mercenaries to save stranded foreign workers. As the rescue helicopters flew overhead, they saw a town devastated below.
They saw pretty well chaos below them. Lots of bodies, some food trucks that the drivers had been pulled out and decapitated and left dead on the road. There was no one else there, just us. And one of the people noticed these various people leaving messages in the sand or the stones asking for help.
Colonel Lionel Dyke's men rescued well over 240 people using just 5 small helicopters. Meryl Knox's husband and 2 sons were among those trapped by ISIS. Only 2 of them made it out alive. Her eldest son was killed in an ambush.
My son's life was taken needlessly, and the survivors, what they're going to have to deal with is just too horrific to comprehend. That you have to try, you'll never get through something like this. They've all been let down.
At stake in northern Mozambique is a multi-billion-dollar gas project being developed by French, American and other energy companies. The rapid rise of this ISIS franchise has taken everyone by surprise. Seen here in a video purportedly filmed after the Palma attack, the group has swelled from a few dozen fighters 3 years ago to over 800 today. Dyke described the group that attacked Palma as a different caliber of terrorist, better trained and with more sophisticated weaponry.
This group of people, I think, is quite well planned. This raid on Palma was by 3 separate columns, as it were.
Mozambican armed forces have yet to take back control of Palma, and they were still coming under fire this week. Overwhelmed residents who managed to escape by boat kept arriving at places of safety, adding to the growing humanitarian crisis, with over 670,000 people already displaced. Refugee camps have more than doubled in size as the insurgency has escalated dramatically in recent months, prompting fears it's a land grab by ISIS in Mozambique, similar to that in Iraq and Syria, giving the terror group a new launching pad for attacks on the West.
More than a week on from the deadly attack in Palma, survivors continue to stream into the town of Pemba. This hall is sheltering some of those who have been displaced. The United Nations says it has recorded more than 9,000 people so far. Many were separated from their loved ones during the chaos. This woman left behind her husband and daughter as she fled for her life after hearing machine guns.
Quando percebi que a minha vida estava em perigo, tinha que fugir para o mato para poder se esconder, para defender a minha saúde e a minha vida. Se escondemos a partir de quarta-feira, dia 23, ainda não me senti bem, porque eu se desloquei, saí do meu lugar onde vivia, no meu distrito onde vivia, para cá.
Dozens were killed in Palma as hundreds of militants linked to the Islamic State group targeted shops, banks and military barracks on the 24th of March. On Friday, French energy giant Total shut its operations and withdrew staff from a site in Afungi, 10 kilometres away. It's understood the decision was made after drone surveillance showed that insurgents were very close to the gas plant. Meanwhile, the World Food Programme has temporarily suspended evacuation flights from Palma due to a deterioration in the security situation. A spokesperson said flights for humanitarian workers and food would continue. The situation in Palma remains volatile as a heavy military presence continues to secure the area. Insurgents attacked 2 security posts south of the town on Thursday.
Il y a 160 millions d'années, une grande forêt pousse sur un territoire qu'on appellera un jour la Chine.
A school day is beginning in the Plisson family's living room. Laetitia and her husband have chosen to homeschool their 4 children. A short half hour of world history is followed by different educational projects. From coding to sewing to origami, in this house the children are more or less left to choose their own activities while being closely monitored by Laetitia.
We live our life while also making sure that we work towards the official expectations. But if we don't finish everything, then so be it. And sometimes we'll have done a lot of work in one area and less in another, but it doesn't matter.
The lack of a strict curriculum nonetheless allows the children to acquire a list of skills set by the national education system. Today, and for the first time this year, Moira, Malik and Aloïs are off to school.
Il n'y a pas beaucoup de choses qui ont changé sur la façon dont vous travaillez à la maison, je suppose, par rapport à l'année dernière, si on prend les éléments de...
Over 3 hours of interviews, the team of 3 inspectors and a psychologist check up on what Laetitia and her children have covered over the past year. The inspectors' aim is to discern how much progress the 3 secondary school-aged children have made.
We really just want to check that the child is being taught the core lessons, that they're progressing, and everything is being done to ensure that they progress. We got them to write something. It wasn't really an exercise, but to see how they express themselves, and then to see if their handwriting is up to scratch.
Families like the Plissons have found themselves in the crosshairs of the French government. A new law, formerly known as the Law on Separatism, wants to prohibit homeschooling. The government claims the practice has allowed families to get around national principles such as secularism. The families concerned say they're being unfortunately conflated with secretive independent schools.
Children who are homeschooled are considered to be ghosts of the Republic, or dangerous separatists, or even, like the education minister said, savages.
Words which have offended this family, where the mother has chosen to become a parent instructor.
Who's most able to help children to choose what's best for them? I'd say it's those who love them and those who live with them. I'm sorry Mr. Macron doesn't know my children and he doesn't see them on a daily basis. He doesn't understand their needs.
In the Senate, where the right holds a majority, a committee amendment has just removed Article 21, which established certain conditions for homeschooling. The senator of the centre-right party Les Républicains and member of the Culture and Education Committee says the article contravened a constitutional freedom and was aimed at the wrong target.
Ever since Jules Ferry, the obligation of instruction falls either with state schools, private schools, or homeschooling. Freedom of education is a constitutional right. I think that this law is an emotional law. It allows the minister to flex his muscles. But really, the government would do better implementing laws that have already been passed.
Just 0.5% of pupils in France are homeschooled, a small minority where cases of radicalisation are rare, according to the Ministry of Education. This lecturer says the figure is far too low to be sociologically significant.
The situations that some of these inspectors have encountered are exceptional. The numbers are so small that it's impossible to draw any conclusions. It would be awkward to claim that in a given environment or situation, there are radicalized families. It's just too rare to say that.
Though it remains exceptional, homeschooling has been gaining followers over the last decade. The Plissons have today invited over another family that recently took the plunge. Former teacher Perrine Guette says she was attracted by the supportive community.
It's important for us parents not to feel alone in this, and then of course it's even more important for the children. It gives them the opportunity to make friends, even if they keep in touch with friends still in school.
While senators voted against more requirements for homeschooling, the Ministry of Education insists that every child must now receive a compulsory national ID number. The ministry says there are currently some 5,000 children who are unaccounted for, whose method of instruction, whether at school or at home, is unknown.